Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Powers, the Executive Director of the Society for Science at User Research Facility. Welcome to our second roundtable discussion on the Universal Proposal System. This second session is building off of the July 9th first session on the Universal Proposal System. That discussion prompted additional questions, leading to today's next agenda. I'll put a link for that July 1st session in the chat, and it'll be available in some of our other communications. A brief description of the agenda for today. The Universal Proposal System, just as a first baseline description, is a configurable shared platform supporting the submission, management, review, and allocation of user scientific proposals to a few different user facilities. The roundtable today is going to cover details such as calls and resources, surveys, review panels, conflicts of interest, and allocation, and more about how to engage with UPS. Currently, the Universal Proposal System is in use at the Advanced Photon Source at Argonne National Laboratory, the Linac Coherent Light Source at SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory, and is planned and being integrated into the National Synchrotron Light Source 2 at Brookhaven. The roundtable today will be led by Jacki Flood, the Proposal Submission Specialist at the Advanced Photon Source User Office, and by Paul Jones, User Program Coordinator for the LCLS and the MeV-UED facilities at SLAC. We also have Connie Vanny, Assistant User Program Manager of the APS, and perhaps Lisa Escalante, who's an IT Program and Project Manager at Argonne National Laboratory. They may be called on to speak up and help with some questions. We encourage you to submit questions into the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat as the conversation is going. And you'll also have the opportunity to ask your question directly. It'll be, in essence, your choice. I can either read your question via the chat, or I can call on you and you can ask your question directly that way. One last note then about SURF. The goal of our, well, let me back up also. The Society for Science at User Research Facilities is a nonprofit professional society working to promote and serve the interests of the user facility community. And as such, one of our realms of activity are creating these roundtables to convene the relevant stakeholders to discuss issues of concern to users. And the goal of this series really is to bring together the experts and other users within the user facility ecosystem to share best practices, challenges, aspirations, and ideas to leverage and increase the impacts of technologies within the nation's network of user facilities across various federal agencies. So with that, let me turn this over to Jacki Flood, and I'll be monitoring things from the side, Jacki. Jacki, to you, thank you.
Thank you. All right, let me get my screen share going. Okay, you guys should be seeing my slides. Yeah. So today we thought we would take you guys through some of the back-end functionality of the UPS. It's a very high-level presentation, but it's very easy to get into the weeds of the functionality within UPS because there's just so much functionality to talk about. So we're going to do our best to keep it moving smoothly, but please feel free to jump in with any questions as they come up, and Paul and I'd be happy to dive in on any particular slide that you find yourself with questions. All right, there we go. So as we started working through UPS, we discovered that there seemed to be an order of operations that we needed to follow in order to successfully set the system up for each facility to run smoothly. So this is going to be a high-level document about the order of operations, and then some details within on how you would go to set up your facility and then the rest of the system in order to get to the point where you would be able to launch a call. So these are the high-level steps to configure UPS from scratch, and working in the sequence on the screen will help ensure that all of the related records that you need to have created are actually created before you get to a step where you get blocked. And this actually naturally came about one afternoon while we were working through configuring things, and I had gotten us to the point where UPS was getting ready to go live for our feature call. And I kind of took note of things that we needed to do in a certain order, because I found myself being blocked and realizing, oh, this needed to be done in a first step so that everything ran smoothly. And so with that conversation, I think it was between Paul and Nancy and I, we were able to put together a document as a knowledge article on the back end of UPS that said very, very high level, not pretty. It's going to turn into something more, but these steps need to happen in order so that you can more seamlessly get through the system from A to Z in creating your facility and your call and all the things in between in order to get ready to launch for a live call. So the rest of the presentation is kind of going to dive into each one of these sections at a very high level for us. So we start off with creating your facility. This facility table, I guess really, Paul, might be helpful to say that UPS is built on all these relational data tables, right? Every table kind of connects to another in a certain way, and you can access each table in multiple different pathways. Anything you want to add there, Paul? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what we've tried to do is, there's the sort of core data that the system relies on for all of its workflow functionality is referenced from these different tables. So instead of sort of hard coding which facilities can use the system, which types of proposals and so on, we've built these tools to be able to define those conditions and those criteria within the system by the administrative users. And yeah, just to sort of touch on what Jacki was saying about sort of as you're configuring things for the first time, a lot of these dependencies are driving workflow. So if there isn't a sort of related record to reference, the workflow won't work, which is why we kind of define this order of operations so that you create the records before you reference them.
Paul, could I jump in? There's a quick question on slide 2 asking what's the definition of groups?
We're going to get to that in just a second.
Yep.
Okay.
We'll get there. Each one of these categories has mostly its own slide where we'll kind of dive in and get into further detail for you guys.
Okay, very prescient, Sujata.
So at the very beginning, you have to create your facility within the system. And this is where you house the name of the facility, address, phone number. This is where you can add your single sign-on source, your facility photo that you'll see on the front end dashboard. And then there's also some of the configuration settings that are built in here. Because Paul had mentioned, we are trying to configure the system as best as possible so that new onboarded facilities can pick and choose the settings that they wish to implement at their own facility, and it's not hard coded in. So within the screenshot, you can see here, a few of the configurations in this area are whether or not your facility would participate in the normalization of the review panel scores. You can also adjust the label for your experiment time. At APS, we use shifts. Some other facilities might use hours. When we were testing, we used parsecs just to make sure that it all worked. So you can adjust your time label there. And then on the calls page on the front end, this is where you'd be able to indicate a message. If your facility doesn't currently have an open call, you can give a description as to why. All right, so you get your facility set up, and the next step would be, whoops, and click happy, groups, which is where that question came from. So you have to create and manage the groups within the system, and groups are where your permissions lie. So in order, UPS as a whole is a role-based system. So depending on what groups or roles you are assigned will determine what you see within the system. So what we have listed on the screen here are just very high-level groups that we have already created, or the programmers have created on our behalf. And that includes things like a facility super admin. So that would be me, Paul, Nancy, Kim, Connie, Leilani. We have the ability to control the system at its highest level. Below that is a facility admin, which I believe is just the facility super admin permissions, less the ability to delete a record. And then staff groups fall underneath that. And these kind of all compound onto one another. So they do have to be created in a specific manner. And before you can create your resource staff groups, if you see down here, these other groups have to be created because they are assigned as a parent or a managing group for those kinds of facilities. Once you are added to any of these groups, it assigns automatically roles that are kind of more of the behind the scenes functionality for the permissions that you're being given. Then we also go into different panels where we have review panels and allocation panels, both of which have many layers of depth to them. Within the panels, we have technical panels, management panels, scientific review panels, feasibility review panels. What am I missing, Paul?
You've covered a lot of the territory. I mean, the other thing that we've implemented at LCLS is a safety review panel. Yeah, basically there's a lot of freedom to define different groups who have different responsibilities in the review process.
And
Jackie, could I ask, this is Dan, just curious, are there actually written definitions of these different groups, or is it in essence intuitive and not needing to be overthought?
I believe within the core of the knowledge articles that the programmers have created, there is a definition somewhere. I don't know that Paul and I have it readily available to us, but it would be a good thing to have in a more readily available knowledge article. I'm sure that's on the way. We'll get to knowledge articles in a different screen today, maybe. But knowledge base and knowledge articles are where we can put those kinds of definitions and steps for utilizing the system, depending on what group you're in. There's some for external users, internal users, and facility admin users. So
Okay.
I believe it does. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I was just going to add one more point on this because basically within each sort of record type, there's sort of metadata associated with the field labels and the field names, so you can actually define within the system what the field's referencing. I'll admit the documentation on those is a little patchy, so we definitely need to beef that up. But there's for a lot of the kind of core fields, it is relatively intuitive, but there's definitely some places where we're kind of chasing our own development in terms of making sure the documentation actually matches what's been built, as opposed to what we initially thought we were going to build.
I had a couple other questions on that. Is it possible for a facility to define their own groups, perhaps either a version of these or additional ones?
Oh, I would say
Yes.
so. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, so we've got a list of so for example, in review panels, we've got a list of review panel types, which has been defined in the system. But then within those types, you can create as many or as few panels as you need. If we needed to add new types of review panel, that could also be done. We would just need to go through our kind of governance process to make sure that the types don't conflict with anything that's already in use at other facilities.
That makes sense. And how about this? If you, in the case of a consortium of facilities such as LaserNet US, could that be considered the facility?
Yeah, LaserNet is a slightly complicated scenario, but it's so fundamentally the way UPS is designed, the LaserNet consortium is being treated as the facility. Although this is actually one of the things that we've, since we started doing the development work, we've realized that a lot of the kind of labels and terminology need to be more flexible. So that, the example of, being able to replace kind of shifts with hours or parsecs or shot days or whatever it is that you're defining as your label for that field. We're realizing we could do the same sort of thing with other field labels as well. So potentially we can add some functionality to, reclassify some of these sort of hierarchies within the data structure so that they function the same way but have different labels for different institutions.
All right, thank you.
All right, from groups we head to proposal types. And every facility has the ability to create as many proposal types as they need, given whatever name you deem appropriate. So this is APS's general user regular proposal type. They're all facility assigned. So you won't use a different facilities label in your workflow system because you can assign them by facility. This is also where some more of the configuration options lie. This is where you would be able to determine what types of reviews are assigned to that proposal type. So for our regular users, we want the proposal review to be required. That's our scientific review. We want a score to be required for that, but you have the ability to leave it off if you so choose. And then after those scores are done and completed by that PRP panel, APS specifically would like to have an admin review required before those get released to the user community. We do that as a sanity check. But again, you can choose to use this or not. And then we have the review type of an ETR review, which we classify at APS at least as our feasibility review. So having it checked off as required will launch that feasibility review so that the beamline can look at it and comment on feasibility, but it doesn't prohibit the workflow from moving forward if it isn't completed. You could also require a score on that feasibility review and require a feasibility review for all of the follow-on time requests that comes later on down the line after the initial proposal submission. APS proposals are good for 6 cycles. So a follow-on ETR would be put on for each one of those cycles if the proposal wanted to be considered to get time during that specific cycle. So if you clicked this box here, then that means that it would trigger a feasibility review for the beamline staff for each follow-on ETR. Paul, anything to add on this screen?
I wouldn't add anything too specific except to say that this will probably grow over time as we add more and more kind of configurable functionality. And again, like what we've started with is sort of the very sort of fundamental process, I would say. But over time, we're already starting to come up with a lot of things where we've kind of defined a basic flow, and now we want to be able to configure kind of more granular detail within that. So this is probably where those configuration options will appear.
Yeah, I would say either in the proposal types or in the facility field would be where we'd see a lot of those configuration options. So allocation types. Within the system, we have the ability to create whichever allocation types you so choose. The ones listed are APS allocation types. We have the beam time allocation, which is the back, general user, rapid access, staff, and director's discretionary. And these are just categories of time to which a proposal can be allocated against. For APS, and I believe for LCLS as well, UPS isn't the source of truth for our reporting, but we can still use allocation types as a way to make sure that we don't overcommit time to any given category of time. It's pretty much if you're allocating within the system, we have a live counter on each of these allocation types that will allow you to watch the progress of allocation so that you don't overcommit proposals and end up having, 25 more shifts that you have allocated, but now you really don't have the time to allocate. And I know Paul has some really great detail that he can share along this slide as well. So I'll pass it over to you, Paul.
Yeah, this concept of sort of allocation types, it allows for a bit of flexibility that we realized is sort of necessary within the real world, even if it's not necessarily how things would work in a sort of dream state, right? Because what we find, I mean, certainly, on the LCLS side, what we find in practice is that proposals can be submitted with one set of intentions, but ultimately get awarded time for some other reason. And so this allows us that flexibility to define what kind of time, what kind of experiment is actually taking place, even if that's different to what was initially requested. And a good example of that would be a proposal that gets submitted to the general user program, goes through the PRP review, and maybe doesn't quite rise to the level of being awarded time directly through that general user program. But I mean, in the case of LCLS, we've certainly had examples where that proposal has sort of other benefits for the facility that aren't necessarily sort of obvious to the scientific review panel. So maybe it's helping to develop some functionality or do some testing of equipment that otherwise wouldn't necessarily benefit the users directly. And so in situations like that, the director has the discretion to assign that experiment beam time through the director's discretionary program, which I can't remember exactly what the percentage is. It's somewhere between 5 and 10% of the overall time for the facility in our case. And in that situation, rather than make the users kind of resubmit the proposal, go through that process again, we can just we can allocate the time as director's discretionary time, even if the proposal was submitted as a general user program through the general user program.
Paul, this is Dan. Could I ask, I think you just clarified this, but there's a question from Andrea asking if you could convert one kind of proposal to another, as an example of converting an unsuccessful approved program proposal to a general user proposal.
Yeah, so converting the proposal type is not what we're sort of labeling it as in UPS. So there's a few reasons for that. One of the things to bear in mind, the proposal type is one of the things that drives the review workflow. So as part of the process, changing the proposal type, you don't want to do that if it's going to change the workflow, unless it needs to change the workflow. But this allocation type allows us to, taking Andrea's example, you could award it general user time, even if it came in as an approved program request. And I think that would probably be the correct application in that example. But yeah, we deliberately decided to try and sort of restrict what could be changed between the proposal being submitted and the award happening, in part to maintain and protect that audit trail.
One of the other things regarding changing proposal type is that a lot of our surveys, which we'll get to later in this presentation, surveys are where you can collect the bulk of the information about the proposal from the proposing team. And those can be customized according to your needs. And so a lot of, and at least at APS, certain proposal surveys are connected to a proposal type because of the needs we have for that proposal type. So switching the proposal type after it's been fully submitted has the potential to lose information that you would typically gather from a user if they started the proposal type from the beginning of the proposal process. For an example, we have general user proposals that have a specific set of questions, and then we have partner users proposals that have a different set of questions. If we were to switch that proposal type after submission, we would miss out on a huge chunk of the information that we ask for the partner user proposal type. Are there any more questions? Go ahead.
Yes. What did you mean by survey? Because you were just.
So surveys are, we're going to get to that in future slides, but surveys are pretty much where you can customize the questions that you want asked for each particular proposal type or proposal call. So all those questions that a user would come in and answer about their proposals, they are created in a survey in UPS.
Okay. Thank you. And I know you have a lot of content, already just a time check, 11:25. So I'll let you pace yourself accordingly.
Okay, great. Did anybody have any other questions on allocation types before we move forward?
There weren't, although we might get into some more later at the Q&A as people have just some more customized nuances to their existing processes.
Sure. Okay, so the next step of what you have to create within the system are resources and then the metadata associated with those resources. So this is a screenshot from the back end of a resource record. You can name your resource, associate it to your facility, you assign it a sort order, so you can put it in the list accordingly. A list view from like a user front end view. Then you can add a long name and description. It has the operating status. I cannot off the top of my head rattle off all of our operating statuses, but available to users, operating but not available to users. I think under construction might be one. And you can select the appropriate status for your resource. Down here, you're going to see resource staff and allocation reviewers. And this kind of circles back to that groups slide that we showed you earlier. So because at the point, if you're following this through what we've created, we've already created all of these resource staffs, all these resource groups, staff groups. So as I'm creating this resource itself, I've already gone in and created a staff group for each one of my resources. This functionality will, being a part of this group will allow you to see the proposals for this given resource, view the resource information, allocate if you are in the allocation reviewer section. What am I missing? Do feasibility reviews. That's all the kind of things that these groups would allow you to do. The technical feasibility panel, that's where you do the feasibility review. So within this page, you can also assign the specific allocation types that we just spoke about to a given resource. So depending on the resource and the functionality, it might not have all of the allocation types that you've created for your facility assigned to it. Specifically at APS, some of our beamlines are national user facility beamlines. That means all of their time goes to the general user population, but not all of our beamlines qualify as that role. So we could exclude that type if we so choose. This is where you can also associate a resource to its given instruments and techniques. Instruments and techniques are different tables within the system. They can be created at any time. They don't have to have an order of operations. So if somebody created a new instrument for 1ID or 1BM, 2 years from now, I would simply be able to create it in the instrument table and then go to the record here and associate it directly to my resource. And associating these techniques and instruments on this page is how we customize what the user sees as they're submitting their proposal. So if they're going through their proposal submission, they get to the experiment time request and they select 1BM. By selecting 1BM, they will then see only these instruments to be able to select for that appropriate resource, as well as only these techniques. You can also associate keywords to a resource at this time. What we didn't actually get into at this point is the fact that UPS has an extended resource guide section, which is where you can add additional information about your given resource. NSLS-II plans to use this for their beamline guide. It's got some amazing capabilities. APS isn't quite at the point where we can use this yet. We still have a standalone system, but we're super excited to get to the point where we would be able to launch that extended resource guide and kind of combine our beamline guide all into one within the UPS instead of having two standalone systems. Any questions, anything to add, Paul?
I don't think I have anything to add. I think you've covered it pretty well there.
I feel like I'm flying through this, but if I don't stay focused, we'll get too far into a rabbit hole because it's very easy to just kind of dive in and get lost within the system. Okay, so after you create your resources, you can then create your run cycles. And run cycles are assigned to proposal calls, which we haven't gotten into yet, but we will. And that will indicate the lifespan of your proposal submitted to that call. So I mentioned earlier that APS general user proposals are good for 2 years or 6 cycles. So when we get to the calls page, you'll see where you can assign the appropriate cycles to determine the lifespan of all the proposals that are associated with that call. But you can create your run cycle, name it whatever you see fit. We at APS just use the name of the run cycle itself, and then it kind of concatenates it to APS 24-2 as you see here. You associate it directly to a facility. The start and end date can be put in and can be adjusted at any time. Because we create run cycles or proposal calls that will allow a proposal to have a lifespan of up to even 15 cycles, depending on what proposal, APS has to go in and create these run cycles in advance. So I have gone in, I think, and created out to 2029-2. And so we don't have a long range schedule to accommodate the actual start and end dates for those kinds of cycles. So what I've done is just put in a placeholder date with about when it would be. And once we get closer to those dates, I can come in here and I can adjust the start and end dates, and that will automatically cycle down to all the proposals connected to this run cycle so that it also receives that update at a live data setting. So as you can see at the bottom of this little screenshot, it also has different tabs of associated information related to this run cycle. This is a really good example of all these relational data tables. They're separate, but they do have some kind of a connection so that you can access each one of these different data tables from within this specific run cycle record. And what I highlighted here is that our cycle 24-2 is related to 2 calls at the moment, our standard general user call and our macromolecular call. I'm going to go into first available and last available dates on a different slide as we go down. But Paul, is there anything here you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just mention these sort of this section at the bottom of the screen that Jackie's sharing shows these sort of related lists. And it's a really great way, especially as a system administrator, to kind of navigate around and find the information you need. So, you know, if you're trying to keep track of which proposals are associated with a certain run cycle or a certain proposal call, the related lists really help you to jump around and find things. There's a lot of other search functionality within the system, but I find that I'm using these related lists more and more to kind of drill into to find very specific information.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it was such a learning curve at first when we started the system because I wasn't used to having multiple ways to get to the data that I wanted to get to. And when you're in this system, you can get to almost any other related data table from any table that you're looking at. So it was like a culture shock to be like, oh my gosh, I can navigate this way, as well as, you know, going through the all and you know, your typical search function. Okay, so then we get to the proposal calls, which is kind of a good segue because we saw that individual run cycle was related to 2 calls. So when you create your proposal call, again, you can name it whatever you'd like, associate it to your facility. And then at this level, you would assign the different proposal types that would be offered within this proposal call. APS has a one-to-one relationship with the call. So one proposal type is offered for each one of our proposal calls. I believe LCLS and NSLS-II are going to be using the system in a different way where multiple proposal types will be associated within one call. This is also where you can determine which resources are available. It's great, super configurable. So if something happens at a beamline midway through an open call, and for whatever reason, they're not going to be able to accept any further proposals, you can go in and remove that resource and no further proposals would be able to be submitted for that resource. You might have to do some damage control and reach out to folks that had already submitted, but you can easily remove it from any future proposals being put in or add one midway through if something does become available. The summary name, I've used this section just as a quick definition spot for the specific proposal call. This one's for macromolecular crystallographies, and I notate that they're good for 6 cycles, no matter the number of shifts. You can use this however you see fit. I've also come, because APS is in this upgraded phase, I've come to using this section to indicate when I add a resource to a call, if it's not at the very beginning of the call opening, just for tracking purposes for my own sanity. Like, when did I do this and why? And I have a note here for it. So this status here would be open, draft, closed, or I think it maybe even expired. And then we have the open date and the deadline date. The functionality is driven by these 2 fields. So if you create it in advance and you put a date in the future, the proposal call will open and be available by the date and time that you select here. And same thing goes with the deadline date. It will close and become unavailable for a user to put a proposal against after the date and time specified on the deadline date. Feasibility, PRP review, and rapid access change dates. These are just informational fields. They don't drive any functionality. So if you have the need or want to reference what date you have the PRP review meetings, you can add that information here. Same thing with feasibility or rapid access change. Proposal guidelines is one of my favorite features of this page. Depending on the proposal call, you might have a specific information for the users that you want to read or instructions about that particular proposal call. So you can add any information that you want here. It also allows for links to be had. So you can see here, we have a link to our APS user registration because we have a requirement within the APS workflow that if you don't have a badge number assigned and connected to your UPS record, you don't have the ability to submit a proposal. And that's due to downstream systems and the functionality there. So if a user reads through this proposal guideline while they're submitting a proposal, and realize that somebody they want to add to their proposal doesn't have a badge number or isn't an active APS user, hopefully they can send them this link and then get it all squared away so they can be added to that proposal.
Jackie,
Go ahead.
This is Dan. Quick question. Possible to have almost a grace period to the deadline or some kind of flexibility there?
Yeah,
well,
I can answer this because this is actually an enhancement that we've got in the queue. It's not like top of our priority list right now, but it's definitely one we're thinking about. I have mixed feelings about it because on the one hand, I wish people would just respect deadlines. On the other hand, I totally understand that in the real world, you know, a grace period can be beneficial, and so we've basically had to handle that manually to date. So we've adjusted the deadline as the 5 minutes before it closes, sort of extended it for an hour basically, to help those people out who were sort of struggling with the fact they didn't realize the deadline was 5 minutes away, not an hour and 5 minutes away. But there's as things are currently built, it is a hard and fast date and a hard and fast deadline. But we have a couple of different ideas for how we could make that a little bit more flexible.
Right. Thanks. Yes, I know. Think time zones. That's the sort of oops when someone's thinking they have enough time and turns out it was 2 hours ago that they were supposed to be finished.
Yeah, I get that. One of the functionalities within UPS is the ability for a user to set their time zone within their profile on the front end. And once you do set that time zone, if you go in and are thoughtful enough to make sure you are in the right time zone, it will adjust the times that you see on your view to be the appropriate time zone. So if it's 12 p.m., I'm bad with time zones, and Paul's the first one to know this. It's not my, it'll adjust the time zone and the deadline date to whatever your time zone is without getting too technical. Paul, you can give a better example if you could think of it.
Yeah, it's just, so a time zone of, a deadline of midnight Central Time would be a deadline of 10 p.m. Pacific, for example. And it would show those two different time zones it would show the two different deadlines to two different users based on where they are.
Or not where they are necessarily, or what they selected as their user profile time zone.
Yeah.
So you have to be cognizant and select it in the appropriate time zone to see the appropriate time zone for where you are.
Yeah, although if you don't specify a time zone, it does default based on your location. So it still tracks it. It's obviously that things can get complicated with time zones if folks are using VPNs and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of room for people to do things wrong when it comes to dates and times, which is why we're still looking at that enhancement to give people a little bit of flexibility.
Thanks, Paul. So now we're back on proposal calls continued. And this is kind of like the bottom of that proposal call page on the back end. And I had mentioned earlier that a run cycle is how you determine the lifespan of a proposal. So within the proposal call that you're working on, you have the ability to assign the appropriate run cycles to give the lifespan that you wish to give to the proposals submitted against that call. So for example, on this one, we have run cycle 24-3 all the way out to 26-2. And this gives a pretty good visual as to how those start and end dates work that I mentioned earlier. We don't have a schedule for 26-2, so I anticipated the start and end date as close as I could based on history at the APS. And then when I get the finalized start and end date, I will update it within the record for the run cycle. And then every single proposal call that this run cycle is associated with will update automatically with the new date that I submitted. But what I wanted to highlight here is the run cycle availability dates. Because this particular run cycle will be used across multiple proposal calls, and not all of them might have the same, I don't want to say call dates, I guess that would be right. We have the flexibility to individualize the first available and last available date that run cycle can be selected by a user on the front end of the system, depending on what call it's associated with. So for example, right now, what we were looking at was the macromolecular call for 24-3. And it's got all 6 of these run cycles associated with it. But we also just opened a rapid access call for 24-3 for general users. So the rapid access call for 24-3 has a first available date of September 30th, and a last available date for the last date of the 24-3 run cycle, which is probably December 18th here at this point. But in a general user call for 24-3, we wouldn't want anybody to be able to submit those proposals for that run cycle after the submission deadline, which was back in June. So the ability to configure the first available dates of each run cycle, depending on what proposal call it's associated with, is a huge plus to this system. And then within this action selected on rows, if you drop this down, you can checkbox whichever proposal run cycle you are working on. And then there's an option to update every single proposal call associated with either this run cycle or that proposal call. So every proposal that was submitted to a previous call but now has the ability to put a time request against 25-1 will be updated with the most recently available date for that run cycle. And I don't think I did that justice because it's very complicated. But Paul, what do you have to add to that one?
Yeah, no, this is definitely one of those things that's a little bit complicated to wrap your head around. And I think we struggled with it when we were first configuring this to make sure it gave us kind of the level of functionality and flexibility that we wanted. But the really great thing about it is that it lets you, at a very granular level, decide who can apply for time when, essentially. And it can be based on, which proposal call they submitted their proposal to, which run cycle they're looking to get time in, what type of proposal it is. Lots of different sort of criteria that you can really use to drill down. And even at the individual proposal level, let's say you've got a proposal that, as an example at LCLS, we had a proposal that was granted time in the last run cycle, but due to a power outage, they didn't get the chance to do their experiment. So we basically opened up the opportunity for them to resubmit a new request for time in the following cycle so that they would do the experiment the next time around. And that was obviously, sort of a very specific edge case, but it just illustrates kind of the level of configurability that we have in the system.
Yeah, that's a great example to show the flexibility. Thanks. All right, and then we are on to the proposal and ETR surveys, which I know got questions earlier through the presentation. So as we mentioned, the details of either a proposal or an experiment time request are collected via what UPS calls a survey. Those can be conditionally triggered, which we can get into if we have time. And the survey designer is one of the coolest functions, I think, within the UPS, because it allows for you to individualize your surveys in so many different ways. So we have the ability to customize question formatting. And what I've got in the screenshot here is just each of the different question types that you can pull into a survey. So you can require an attachment of detail to be added in a question. You can do the typical choice dropdown where you have 5 choices and it's a single select. The Boolean, I don't know how to pronounce it. That one, I can't remember what that one was for, Paul. It's another configurable option. And I can't remember if it's a multiple choice field or is it just the yes, no's? Maybe that's the yes, no option.
Yeah, Boolean is less yes, no.
Yeah. So you can see here that there's just endless options of different proposal types of questions. The string option is just a free text field. You can have them a requirement for an image if you so choose. Tons of configurability there. And then the other nice feature, and I only picked a couple features out of this because there's so much that this section can do, but I did a high level of what I thought were kind of the coolest. And then that's that we have a question bank. So you can add questions to the question bank. So you don't have to recreate that question every time you want to use it in a separate field, because though we have different surveys for different proposal types, a lot of those questions are asked the same way over and over again and need to be asked. So if you add it to the question bank, You can use that very same question, which makes reporting on that question feasible. You can also add it under a category, so you can easily find that question and pull it into any survey that you wish to create. All right, and then in terms of triggering these, you can trigger them to, you can configure them so that they trigger on a proposal call. You can configure them so they trigger on a proposal type. What are our other options that we can configure with? Certain statuses for follow-on ETRs, configurability and triggering options are pretty much endless. Anything you pretty much want to do, you can do through the conditional triggering. Paul, you got anything to add there?
Yeah, this is an incredibly powerful tool, but also really hard to explain without kind of getting into the weeds of actually doing it. And essentially, the trigger conditions that would prompt a set of questions to be asked are basically any change to any table in the system. It's that flexible, and that can be sort of a little intimidating to start with. But it's just hugely powerful. So yeah, I mean, as an example, we've been talking at LCLS about basically doing sort of a survey of our reviewers after they complete their reviews to kind of get their feedback on the review process. And in the past, we would have done this in a standalone form, whether it's, Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or Google Forms or whatever, and we would have just sort of asked these questions sort of on their own. But now we're realizing we could actually do this through UPS. We could ask the questions directly within the system, and we could ask them based on when people have finished the review process, rather than have it be, someone manually going and creating that survey and collecting the data and then, compiling it all in a standalone system. So, I mean, it's just one example of something we haven't done yet, but it's totally doable with all the configuration that we already have in place.
Thank you, Paul and Jackie. This is Dan. This is a particularly compelling resource that you're developing here. I like this. Just a quick time check. We have about 10 minutes left, and I can and we can stay on a little bit later, but in advance, for those who may need to drop off if we're continuing before we get to additional Q&A. This is being recorded. It'll be available on our website, our YouTube channel. Everyone who's registered, I'll be sending out a note when it's available. So if you're not able to stay on longer as we continue the conversation, it will be something you can catch up on at your convenience on demand. All right, back to you, Jackie.
Yeah, and you know what? That was great timing, because I think that is my last slide. So we're ready for our in-depth questions. And if anything comes up that might be best for us to jump into the system to share, I'm open to that too. If I can figure out how to stop sharing, I will be able to see you guys.
Okay. And I'd say if you want to ask questions directly, you can unmute yourself and raise your hand, or otherwise ask right away, or put any question in chat. And I'll open the floor right now. Who else has questions, perhaps even suggestions? Know that not that Jackie or Paul would be empowered or resourced to make significant new changes, but I suppose they're all ears as to what else would be great to add to this. Let's see, I see a first question from Chuck. He was just asking, when was this built on ServiceNow? How old is the system, the portal?
So
no, just was asking if it was ServiceNow.
We're using a ServiceNow instance. We actually set it up as its own standalone instance of ServiceNow, rather than kind of leveraging any of the existing instances we have at the stakeholder labs. And that was sort of semi-deliberate. It was partly because we wanted to have a lot more permission control over the system. And it was also to sort of allow that separation where it doesn't have to be kind of tied in with any of the existing infrastructure and rules and policies that exist at any one lab. And the other big benefit is that because it's not sort of tied in with our local systems, we've got a bit more control over the sort of security access from a cybersecurity perspective, because users in this system aren't getting access to a central resource that the labs are using for other functions. So, I mean, certainly from a cybersecurity perspective, that helped us sort of clear a few hurdles. But it also gives us a way of, sharing access to the system without having to compromise any of the, the kind of core functions that the labs are using within their own ServiceNow environments.
Thanks.
Thanks. Right. How about this question? If and when when can a new facility join to use the UPS? What's the integration, the timeline or process?
So I don't know if Lisa Escalante is able to chip in and help answer this question, but I can give a sort of initial high level response from my perspective. The short answer is we just don't know exactly what that timeline is. The longer answer is that we've started to sort of investigate this, and we've talked to some of the procurement legal folks at the labs to get feedback on what new stakeholders would need to do to be able to sort of buy in, if you like. I have to admit, this is an area that I have basically zero expertise and zero experience. So I'm sort of learning for the first time that there's lots and lots of layers of complexity and bureaucracy to that, because fundamentally this is an application that was developed using Department of Energy, Basic Energy Sciences support and funding. And so sharing that with entities outside of that group is probably more complicated than we anticipated. And then obviously, when you take it further and further, you've got different layers of, within the Department of Energy, within the federal government, within the United States, and internationally, there's more and more layers of sort of thought that has to go into the process of onboarding new facilities. So I don't think it's impossible to bring in sort of external stakeholders outside of that little network, but I think it will probably be easiest if you're already sort of within that, within the sort of smallest of those circles, if that makes sense.
I saw that Connie Vanny had raised her hand, and then Sujata, I see your hand raised. Connie, did you have a comment there?
No, I think Paul answered that beautifully, and
Okay.
The Center for Nanoscale Materials has begun some movement towards joining UPS. So we're grateful to them for being willing to kind of go through this process the first time with us. And we're hoping to learn a lot to smooth the road for other facilities that are interested in joining. So.
Thank you. And then Sujata, is that how I say your name correctly? Yes, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you could ask a question.
Oops.
And then Andrea will come to you.
Sorry. Thanks, Dan. So I have questions about the extension. So you showed the demo. Are there any plans to extend this product, or do you think that this is the only product, this will be it, and then you will keep on maintaining, or what are the plans going forward?
I'm happy to throw an answer out there. I mean, this is by no means the end. We have a very, very long list of enhancements and improvements and ideas that we've already kind of pulled together for ways we can make it even better. And as I mentioned in some of the chat comments as well, there's definitely places where we can kind of improve the configurability, if that makes sense. Make it easier to reconfigure different things for different facilities and different environments and different situations. And I think that, one of the biggest challenges with this entire project has been trying to kind of establish that kind of core functionality that is, truly universal, but not prevent configurability that needs to exist. And, if we just kind of lock everything down and say, this is a very rigid thing and this is how it works, and you kind of use it how it is or else, there's not really ever going to be any potential to grow that tool, right? It's always going to be kind of restricted to that functionality. So what we've tried to do is kind of take that approach of we've defined the spine of the system, but we need to be able to kind of put all those branches out and give all the flexibility to go off in different directions from that spine, without kind of breaking that core functionality.
Yeah, looking at the product, I felt that if I want to configure, let's say, my system to this, and if I want to have my database integrated to this, like how would I do that? So these were like the initial questions which I had, and I was wondering like, I think this is something probably you would be working on, or I don't know, like, if this thing exists already.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about using the ServiceNow platform is that integrations with external systems are sort of, you know, fundamental to what they do. There's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of built-in tools to, I mean, you can basically, you know, replicate the data structure in your local system without any development work. You could just take the information, you know, using table by table, grab the API and just drop the data into your system to use as you see fit. Obviously that's not the smartest way of doing an integration. You probably want some more sort of sophisticated APIs that give you more ways of relating the data. But that's also relatively easy to do. I mean, we've built several APIs for APS, for LCLS, for NSLS that allow us to integrate data backwards and forwards, to update records in one system based on changes in another. And I mean, as an example, one of the really nice things about having this shared tool is being able to collect kind of common data about people, which allows us to actually relate those people to each other downstream. So, you know, the fact that we've integrated the user login with ORCID has given us that kind of key to be able to identify people. And so, you know, people can log into different systems using that same ORCID credential, and we already have a tool to link that data back to the person that submitted the proposal.
And if we have further questions, how can we, like, who is the best person to reach out?
Definitely call. Anyone.
I would say any of us. We're working pretty closely as a group. So we, you know, if we get questions about the system, we're talking about them and sharing them with each other, and we're happy to answer any questions folks have. And yeah, we want to get as many people involved in this as we can. I would say we're probably moving a little slower in that direction than I would like us to be. But you know, I mean, you know, I had a conversation with one of the legal folks at SLAC, and they basically said, you know, there's so many sort of unknowns in this realm because it isn't something that the labs do on a sort of routine basis in terms of sort of, you know, building applications, then sort of passing them around, as it were. And you know, it takes a little bit of thought. But I think, you know, the conversations that I've had with folks at BES, they're really supportive of the fact that we've done this work and that they want it to become something that, you know, more and more facilities can use. I just think we need to make sure we're, you know, sort of dotting all the I's and crossing the T's from a sort of process perspective to make sure we don't tread on anyone's toes or upset anyone.
Paul, thank you. I'm going to jump in. We're up to time now, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for the last hour. We can continue this on informally, but just to respect everyone's time, we likely have people have to jump off for another roundtable. So I'll say, or to answer emails, whatever else they have to do. But let me say thank you here. We'll stop the recording, but if people would like to stay on and continue to ask some questions, I know Andrea had her hand raised before, so thank you all for joining. We'll end the formal agenda here, but can continue on for a few more minutes if you'd like to stay. Thank you again, Jackie and Paul. This is really great information. And we'll consider if a third roundtable would be helpful, born of questions from today and other next steps that are happening with the UPS. Thanks, everyone.